What would you do if one snowy morning you opened the door to your barn and found a strange woman asleep on the cold floor, clutching a journal to her chest? A journal with only one name written inside, your son's. This isn't a break-in. This is the beginning of a truth so powerful, it will shake everything you thought you knew. If you believe in second chances, in healing, and in the kind of family that finds you in the heart of winter, hit that subscribe button, turn on the bell, and let us know how you feel after watching this story. Because this one might just make you believe in kindness again. Snow fell thick, like all the things that had never been said. Wind slipped through the cracks of the old wooden barn, howling like a ghost from the winters Nathaniel had survived, with nothing but a rusted wood stove and his 10-year-old son, Julian. He didn't expect to see those eyes when he opened the door of Brookside Barn to grab more firewood, eyes wide with panic, eyes of someone who had run from something or lost everything. She was curled up in a thin sleeping bag, her faded coat barely shielding her from the cold, snow-dusted hair tangled across her face. Beside her lay an old leather-bound journal, cracked and worn, the cover slightly open. Just enough for Nathaniel to see his son's name written inside. Not once, not twice, but at least 10 times. Who are you, and why is that name in your journal? He didn't ask that, yet. He only said, "There's no heat in here. If you don't want to freeze to death, come inside." Anastasia didn't beg. She didn't resist. She just clung to the journal like it was the only thing keeping her alive. And just like that, she stepped over the threshold into the home of a father and son. What Nathaniel didn't know was this. He hadn't just opened the door for a stranger. He may have opened it to a piece of his past. Anastasia sat on the edge of the wooden chair near the fireplace, her trembling hands catching the flicker of firelight. She didn't say much, just a whisper. "I'll leave as soon as the sun comes up." But in her voice, something cracked, like the creak of an old door yanked open by the wind. Julian, the boy with curls and eyes that studied grown-ups like puzzles, quietly placed a cup of cocoa on the table and stepped back. He didn't ask who she was. He simply tilted his head. "You know my name?" Then settled by the foggy window again, drawing something only he understood onto the glass. Nathaniel, calm on the outside, took in everything. The fraying scarf, the scratch on her wrist, and the soft hum escaping her lips. A lullaby Julian sometimes murmured in his sleep. A song Nathaniel had never taught him. In his mind, pieces without names began shifting. She wasn't just some traveler caught in the storm. If she knew his son, then who was she? Outside, the snow kept falling, but inside that old cabin, for the first time in years, silence carried a new weight, the quiet breath of waiting. Julian wasn't like most kids who shy away from strangers. He stepped closer, eyes wide, scanning every line of her face. "What's your name?" he asked, still holding a piece of chalk, its dust smudged on his fingertips. Anastasia smiled, though her voice was barely louder than the crackle of the fire. "You can call me Anna." Her gaze lingered on the tousled curls, the proud bridge of his nose, and then stopped, on the tiny birthmark behind his ear, the one she used to kiss in the hospital the day she had to let him go. Julian turned quickly and ran to the corner of the room. He pulled out a notebook and flipped to the middle. "Look," he said, holding it open. "This is from my dream. There's a lady who sings me to sleep, just like you did last night." She froze. He heard it, or had he once heard it long, long ago? Nathaniel stood by the sink, pretending to dry his hands, but his eyes never left them. He saw how her hand trembled when Julian touched her. He saw something deeper in her eyes, more than kindness. It was pain, a silent ache that flowed backward, like someone who had lost something sacred and was now, impossibly, standing right in front of it again. And in that moment, something invisible shifted in the air, softly, but enough to stir the heart. That night, while Anastasia slept soundly on the couch, Nathaniel picked up the journal she'd left on the table. He meant to set it aside, but a loose page slipped out. The handwriting was shaky, the ink smudged, maybe from tears. And there it was, again and again. Julian, his name scrawled over and over. some lines bold and pressed deep, others faint and barely legible. Nathaniel froze. This wasn't coincidence. No stranger wrote a child's name like that. With obsession, with grief. He flipped through more pages. One line caught his breath. I have no right to ask if he's happy. I just hope someone will tell me about him someday. The words pierced deep, like a blade made of memory. The next morning, while making coffee, he glanced at Anastasia sitting by the window. Her gaze drifted toward the snow-covered pines, distant and still. Why is my son's name in your journal? He asked quietly but firmly. She froze, didn't deny it, didn't make excuses. She simply placed a hand over her chest and whispered, because it's the only name that's kept me standing. All this time. Nathaniel said nothing more, but in his eyes something churned, a storm building just beneath the surface, and a quiet fear he couldn't shake. If she was part of a past he thought buried, could she unravel the piece he'd fought so hard to build for Julian? That evening, after a quiet dinner, Nathaniel sat by the fire, wiping down his tools. Julian had already gone upstairs. Anastasia stood in the kitchen doorway, clutching the frayed edge of her old sweater. The silence stretched long before she finally spoke, her voice softer than the wind outside. Julian is my son. Nathaniel's hand froze midair. He looked up, eyes sharp, every instinct on edge. I had him when I was 19. My family made me sign the papers. They moved me away, said I still had my whole life ahead of me. Her voice wavered, but her eyes never left his. I didn't come here to take him back. I just wanted to see how he lives. Just once. The room felt frozen. Only the slow tick of the wall clock dared to move. Nathaniel didn't shout. He didn't throw her out. But on his face, an earthquake barely held in place. Why now? He asked. Anastasia lowered her gaze. Because I thought I'd buried it. But when I heard someone whisper his name in a dream, I knew, no matter what the world had decided, my heart was still a mother's. Even if it was never allowed to be. The next morning the snow had stopped. Pale sunlight slipped through the frosted wooden window frame. Anastasia sat quietly at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a cup of tea long gone cold. Outside on the porch, Julian played with Ghost, his laughter drifting through the air like an old forgotten melody. Nathaniel sat across from her, watching, not with suspicion, but with the eyes of someone who had lived through pain and learned how to recognize honesty when it stood before him. I didn't come to take anything back, she said, her voice barely louder than a breath. It's just, when you've lost a child, you don't hope to reclaim them. You just pray they're okay. He nodded, saying nothing, but his eyes softened, because he knew not everyone understands what it's like to watch your child sleep and wonder, will they still smile like this tomorrow? Anastasia stood and stepped onto the porch, quietly watching Julian laugh in the snow. Nathaniel followed. He placed a hand gently on her shoulder. He's okay, he really is. Then added softer, but I think he'll be even more okay knowing he was never forgotten. There were no tears in that moment, just a breeze that stirred the curtain, and a silence so honest it let both of them, finally, let their guard down. Something had begun. Not love, not family, just trust. Fragile, but real enough to hold on to. From the spaces between them, something began to take shape. Light as breath in the late winter air. Anastasia never inserted herself, never tried to take on a role that wasn't hers. She was simply there, standing quietly beside them. When Julian peeled apples in the tiny kitchen, completely focused. When Nathaniel tended the fire, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. And somehow her presence filled a space none of them realized had been empty. One night the power went out in the middle of a windstorm. The three of them sat around the wood stove, firelight casting a warm blush on their faces. Julian told ghost stories. Nathaniel made hot cocoa. And Anastasia, after so many silent years, let out a laugh so full it made the whole house feel a few degrees warmer. On Sunday morning, she and Julian baked almond cookies. His hands were covered in flour, and for the first time, He turned to her and asked, "When did you learn to bake?" Anastasia smiled. "Since I had a reason worth learning for." Nathaniel looked out the window, and in that moment, he didn't see two strangers anymore. He saw his son, laughing, and a woman no longer lost. No one said it out loud, but they all knew, even if just for a few fleeting days. Sometimes that's all it takes, for a heart to start calling something home. On the final afternoon before the snow began to melt, Julian sat alone by the window, colored pencil in hand, scribbling quietly on a stack of old paper. He didn't say much, only that he was making a gift for someone special. When evening fell, he placed the drawing on the table. It was simple, but it left Anastasia breathless. In the picture were three people, a man, a boy, and a woman, standing beneath a blooming apple tree. At the base of the trunk, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "Thank you for being kind." Anastasia stared at it for a long time. Her hands trembled, her eyes burned. No one knew what the past years had been like for her. But in that moment, this woman, covered in invisible scars, cried like a child. Nathaniel didn't say a word. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, as gently as if he were afraid to disturb something sacred. Julian turned away, pretending not to notice the tears on her cheek. But his heart knew. Something had changed forever. The apple tree in the picture was the same one in their yard. Last season, it had seemed lifeless, bare, done. But this year, it had begun to bloom again, just like them. Three strangers who suddenly had a reason to call each other family. When Julian was asleep, Nathaniel stood by the stove, holding a cup of coffee gone cold, eyes fixed on the worn journal. The name Julian, repeated nearly 30 times across those brief pages, stirred something he'd never dared to consider. This wasn't coincidence. It wasn't fantasy. The next morning, he drove to the Ravenhill civil office in silence. He didn't tell anyone, not even Anastasia. In his hands was a copy of the adoption records from years ago, back when the birth mother's name had been replaced with a coded number. The woman at the records desk studied him for a long moment. Then, after a few keystrokes and ID verifications, she printed a single sheet of paper. There, in soft, cursive handwriting, were the words, "Birth name, Julian, given by biological mother." And in the notes beside it, origin of the name, Latin, meaning gentle, merciful. Nathaniel stood frozen. It felt like a door he'd locked long ago had quietly opened. And this time, there was no closing it. He said nothing on the drive back, only the wind slipping through the crack in the window, and the name Julian echoing through his thoughts, like a message that had always been waiting. Maybe, just maybe, that boy had been loved long before he ever opened his eyes. That afternoon, when Nathaniel returned from Ravenhill, the house was unusually quiet. No sound of Julian's soft giggles. No scent of cinnamon waffles Anastasia often baked in secret during his naps. Just a single folded note placed in the center of the wooden table. No envelope, no name. "Thank you for letting me stay, for not asking the questions I wasn't strong enough to answer. I didn't come to take anything. I just wanted to see him, growing, living, and to know I'm no longer a shadow in his memory." At the bottom, the handwriting trembled, blurred by watermarks. "I'm sorry. I have to leave before I lose the strength to walk away." Nathaniel sat still for a long time. Not angry, not even sad. Just a quiet ache. The feeling of loss once again. But this time, it was different, because now he wasn't the only one who had ever loved that boy with his whole heart. He took the letter and tucked it into the wooden box. The one where he kept Julian's most precious things, the way people hold on to fragments of dreams once left unfinished, hoping that someday they'll find the courage to write the rest. As wind howled across the tin roof and snow began to blanket the wooden porch of the small house in Ridgevale Hollow, Nathaniel knew no one would be leaving tonight. The power was out. Silence wrapped around them. But in that silence, something felt different. Not quite cold, not quite lonely. Anastasia tended the fire, her hands trembling slightly as she placed another log into the stove. Julian curled beneath a blanket, then looked up and asked softly, Do you know how to tell stories? Such a simple question, but it made Nathaniel pause, the kettle halfway to the cup. They'd never sat like this before. Never had a night long enough for someone to tell a story and someone to listen. Anastasia began, her voice gentle. She told a story about a boy named Leo who lived with his father in a forest of pines. She didn't say it outright, but in every detail Julian could see himself. He smiled because he knew it was him, in the eyes of a mother who had once only dared to love from a distance. When the clock struck 11, she began to hum a lullaby, strange, yet familiar. Nathaniel looked over, and for the first time, he saw Julian fast asleep in her arms, as if no space had ever existed between them. And in that small room, while a snowstorm raged outside, something wordless and fragile began to grow. A quiet sense of belonging, no name, but real. The next morning the snow had stopped, but inside Nathaniel a different storm still swirled. He couldn't take his eyes off Anastasia's hands as she made tea, or the sound of her voice as it quietly hummed the same lullaby from the night before. There was something too familiar, too intimate. He sat silently in the old armchair, flipping through the pages of Julian's dream journal. There was an entry, he remembered, where Julian once said he'd dreamed of a woman. She sang a strange lullaby in a voice that trembled. He couldn't see her face, but the warmth of it lingered so deeply, he woke with tears on his cheeks. Nathaniel had dismissed it. Just a child's dream, he'd thought. But now, hearing that very song, every note, every rhythm, from the woman sitting only a few steps away, his chest tightened. This wasn't coincidence. This wasn't just emotion. It was memory, rooted in blood, torn by time, now reaching back across the years, through a song. Anastasia didn't know he was watching. She simply smiled as Julian wandered into the kitchen, still sleepy, stretching wide, and mumbled, "Mom." No one corrected him. No one said a word. Nathaniel lowered his head, his fists clenched in quiet realization. Something irreversible had just happened, and the world from that moment on would never be the same. That night, as Julian slept soundly with Ghost curled beside him, the flickering fire cast soft shadows across Anastasia's face. She sat across from Nathaniel, cradling a cup of cold tea, her eyes distant, staring through the wooden walls of the little mountain house in Briar Hollow. "When I was 19, I wasn't allowed to keep him," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, like she was speaking more to herself than to him. "My family saw it as shameful. They took me away, made me sign the papers. It all happened in 2 days." Nathaniel said nothing, but his chest tightened as he watched her hands begin to tremble. "I used to tell myself, if he was with someone better, maybe he wouldn't have to go through what I did." Her voice cracked. "But every year on that day, I'd write his name. Just once. Only his name." She reached for the journal, opened it to the page filled with looping, desperate strokes. "Julian. Julian. Julian. He's the most beautiful scar I carry," she exhaled, her eyes glassy. Nathaniel swallowed hard. He didn't know whether to be angry or grateful. But he knew one thing for certain. No one writes a child's name 100 times, unless they've loved that child with everything they have. As the soft light of late afternoon stretched across the snowy hills of Pine Ridge, Nathaniel stood by the wooden railing, quietly watching Julian play beneath the pine tree with Ghost bounding at his side. He spoke slowly without turning his head. "Her mom died when Julian was 3. Car accident, so sudden I didn't even get to hold her hand one last time." Anastasia stood still, her lips pressed together, but she said nothing. "Those first nights I didn't sleep." Julian kept asking, "Where's Mom?" I didn't know what to say, so I'd just sit by his bed and sing him a lullaby, a song I don't even remember learning. Anastasia looked up, her eyes meeting his. "The one from last night?" He nodded. "That's the one." Silence settled between them. Only Julian's laughter drifted from a distance. "I used to think I was the only one who lost something," she whispered. "But maybe pain has a way of finding those who can hold it gently." Nathaniel turned, his gaze softer now. "Maybe, because it wants to be understood." And in that moment, without needing a name, without needing to define it. Something took root between them. Quiet, steady, deeper than either expected. Trust, not in perfection, but in pain, finally seen and shared. In the misty morning light of the upstairs loft in the Pine Ridge cabin, Anastasia placed a stack of papers on the worn pine table. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady. "This is a temporary guardianship form," she said softly, "not to take custody of Julian. Just, if something ever happens to you, he won't end up in the system." Nathaniel didn't answer right away. He looked straight at her. No anger, no fear. Just a quiet stillness between two people who had come to understand each other. "How long have you been thinking about this?" he asked. She replied barely above a whisper. "Since you passed out from that flu 3 days ago and still tried to hide it from Julian, and from the way he looked at you, like he was terrified of losing someone else." Nathaniel exhaled, closing his eyes as if swallowing a knot deep in his chest. "You're not planning to leave, are you?" She shook her head. "Number, but if I ever have to, at least I want to leave something that protects him." Nathaniel signed, not because of legal trust, but because he trusted her. This woman who had never once claimed the title mother, but who always quietly put the child first. The scene closed with Julian bursting into the room, throwing his arms around both of them, unintentionally forming a circle that had never had a name. And sometimes family begins with a silent signature. Christmas morning in the town of Blackthorn Ridge began with a light dusting of snow covering the porch steps, the scent of half-baked cinnamon waffles still lingering from the night before. But that morning the kitchen was quiet, no sound of coffee brewing, and the familiar red scarf that always hung on the wooden hook was gone. On the table lay a handwritten letter, the script gentle but certain. "Thank you for letting me stay, even when you had no reason to. Thank you for letting me see Julian happy, something I once only dared to imagine. If life is a circle, I hope one day we'll meet again. Not as strangers." Nathaniel read it in silence. Every word felt like something she hadn't been able to say out loud. Julian shuffled down the stairs, still groggy, rubbing his eyes. "Where did she go, Dad?" Nathaniel didn't lie, but he didn't tell the whole story either. "Maybe she needed to go find a missing piece of her heart," he said softly. "And if that heart finds its way back, we'll be here." The scene closed on one quiet, powerful image, the drawing of the three of them beneath the apple tree, now taped to the fridge, and beneath it, in fresh pencil, "If it's meant to be, home is always a place you can return to." Children have a strange kind of intuition, not built on logic, but on feeling. That day, instead of doing his homework, Julian sat at his desk, pulled out a blank sheet of paper, and began to write. "I don't know why, but I'm happy you were here. You make hot chocolate just sweet enough. Tell funny stories Dad never did, and sing lullabies like the ones I hear in my dreams. I hope you're not cold wherever you're going. I won't call you Mom, but if I could, I'd be glad." Nathaniel read the letter in the hallway, frozen in place. No one had told Julian to write it. No one had to stop him either. That letter was everything that needed to be said. The next morning, Nathaniel drove through the snow-covered woods to Meadowpine Inn, the quiet lodge where Anastasia had stayed just days ago. The woman at the front desk confirmed she'd left early that morning. No number, no forwarding address. Nathaniel placed the letter gently on the counter. "Please give this to her, if she ever comes back." He turned to leave, stepping out into the cold, only to freeze as a taxi pulled up behind him. The door opened, and there she was, still holding the letter, unopened, eyes filled with tears. They didn't speak. They didn't need to, because everything was already written. In a child's hand, and in the silent understanding between two people who had been broken, but never let go. Anastasia never expected that the trembling words of a child could reach so deep, could slip through the cracks inside her that had been frozen over for years. She read each line as if it were the first note of a song she once dropped, now playing again on a heart that had changed. The letter shook in her hands, but her tears, they came freely. Across the street, Nathaniel stood still. He didn't rush forward. He didn't speak right away. He simply looked. And in that look, there was no suspicion left. No walls, only acknowledgement that sometime the heart has to move before the mind catches up. He finally stepped closer, his voice quiet but sure. I don't think this should end with a thank you scribbled in a letter. If you still want to, you can come back, not to apologize, not to fix anything, but to begin. This time, not as strangers. Anastasia met his eyes through the blur of her tears. She didn't answer. Not yet. But for the first time, her hand didn't pull away when he offered his. And in the silent snowfall of a late meadow pine afternoon, two people, who had once been strangers, chose a single act to never be strangers again. She didn't bring anything with her. No luggage, no fanfare. Just an old scarf around her shoulders and eyes that no longer held caution. No one called it coming back. It was simply an afternoon when she knocked on the door, and Nathaniel opened it, as if he'd already known she would. No one spoke of the past, but the mug she used was back on the shelf. Her name, Anastasia, was written neatly beneath almond milk and oat cookies on the grocery list stuck to the fridge. Her laughter echoed through the kitchen as Julian recounted stories from school, mixing with the clatter of spoons against pots, as naturally as if it had always belonged. Julian handed her the scarf he'd been trying to knit. If you'd like, he said shyly, I can finish it for you. She didn't answer. She simply knelt, wrapped her arms around him. For the first time, no longer afraid of what she might lose. Nathaniel stood nearby, a basket of firewood in his hands, watching them, smiling. No declarations, no need for explanations. Just presence, steady, quiet, and deep enough to know a stranger was no longer a stranger. And the little house in the mountains, once just a shelter from the cold, had quietly become a home. The wooden table was set in the middle of the garden, now in bloom after a long, silent winter. The old apple tree, once thought dead, stood full of green buds, its branches dusted with the first white blossoms of spring. Julian placed 3 small glasses on the table, filled with juice he'd made himself, and he was the first to raise his cup. To my mom, who gave me life, to my dad, who raised me, and to today, because today I have both. No one said another word, but their eyes met, and that was enough. No need to judge the past, no need to promise the future. Only the present mattered now. Where 3 people sat together, laughing, grateful, a new swing hung from one of the branches, and beneath the tree, Julian's old drawing had been framed. 3 figures standing beneath an apple tree, with one quiet line beneath it. Thank you for being kind. And if you've ever wondered whether the things we thought were lost can ever be found again, this story is your answer. Family doesn't always begin with blood. Sometimes it begins with a single act of kindness. If this story made your heart pause for a moment, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to hit subscribe so you never miss another story of healing, like the one we shared today. From a single moment, a snowfall at the start of winter, and a stranger standing on a cold wooden porch, what seemed like a simple encounter unfolded into an unforgettable journey. One that reminded us how to trust again, how to forgive, and most of all, how to love. Nathaniel Sterling, a quiet, weathered single father, never imagined that opening his door to a woman seeking shelter on a freezing night would forever change the course of his life and his son's. Anastasia Bennett, a mother who once gave up her child under the weight of pressure and regret, didn't return to reclaim. She came to know, to see that the boy she once lost was happy, and in her quiet surrender, without demands, without expectations, she moved something in Nathaniel. A door he didn't even know was still closed began to open. Together, they didn't repair what was broken. They built something entirely new, a different kind of family, one not born from blood, but from choice, from kindness, from showing up despite the fear of being too late. This story leaves us with a quiet, powerful truth. Family isn't always where we come from. Sometimes it's where we're brave enough to go. The most beautiful things don't always come from the flawless. They come from the scarred, from those who've hurt and healed and still choose to love. Not quickly, but honestly. Maybe you've lost something. Maybe you've stumbled. But if your heart is still warm enough to open, then yes, a miracle can still begin. Even with nothing more than a door opened on a cold winter day.